My name is Franklin Sermons. I'm the director of the Perez Art Museum, Miami, and very, very happy to introduce today Elizabeth Diller. This is the last of the season's Scholl Lecture Series. So some of you will recall we had Julie Meritou, we've had Ed Clark, we've had Polly Apfelbaum, three artists whose work has been in the permanent collection installations over the last year, and three artists that share, I guess, a penchant around painting and abstract expressionism in particular, which goes quite well with the permanent collection gallery upstairs. One thing that I think we all feel is important in that conversation, not just reflecting the art that is up in a given moment, but constantly and continuously checking in on ourselves in regard to architecture. And there's two ways that I think we look at that today. The building, our incredible building that's been here since the end of 2013, done by Herzog and de Meuron. Something that we always try to think about in terms of all of our installations, and certainly played a role in the most recent exhibition opening, which is Toba Kadori, which is a show that I've brought here from Los Angeles County Museum. And it's a show that dovetails a lot with issues of architecture, issues of installation, and the placement of artworks in these type of settings. So I could not be happier than to introduce Elizabeth Diller. Elizabeth Diller is a founding partner of Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, an interdisciplinary design studio that works at the intersection of architecture, the visual arts, and performing arts. Completed works include the Broad Museum, which I was fortunate enough to see go from nothing into the great building that it is now, after living there during that time. The Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, another great institution that shares, I think, an interesting aesthetic with ours, also built to interact with the water on one side. Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, their redevelopment, and also the High Line. Diller and Scofidio were the first in the field of architecture to receive the Genius Award from the MacArthur Foundation, and other recognitions include the Centennial Medal from the American Academy in Rome, the National Design Award from the Smithsonian Institution, the Brunner Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the American Institute of Architects President's Award. The Whitney Museum of American Art held a major retrospective of the studio's work in 2003, and in 2009, Time magazine named them one of the most influential people in the world, the top 100. Fast Company named Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro the most innovative design practice in the profession and among the 50 most innovative companies in the world in 2010. Elizabeth Diller is also a professor of architecture at Princeton University, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Franklin. I have to say, in 2009, we're supposed to be some of the most influential people. In 2017, forget it, it's all over. But I met Franklin, I'm recalling, in a car driving through Detroit. And we were off to a panel, and we were just talking about each other's work, and then this thing got hatched by coming here. And then we had a very interesting exchange around institutions going forward, and cities. Today, what I used to do, I used to have very scripted lectures and very much like a thesis from beginning to end with a point. These days, I think you kind of know when you get to a certain point of your life where you show recent work or you just assemble things, kind of like jazz, just a little bit free association here as I put things together. And I've already confessed to the tech folks here that I've had very bad tech karma today. So if everything explodes, we're going to wing it and just talk. So I hope this keeps together. So as Franklin mentioned, I have done museums. My studio has done museums. We have a love-hate relationship with museums, frankly. And by the way, I really love this one, and I have huge respect for the architects here. No, and architects actually do like one another, despite what you hear, that there's so much competition. But the very first one we did was this one in Boston that was on the Boston Harbor. And this actually, after a couple of decades of independent work, trying to steer clear of the museum. And I'll just flash through some slides. One of the most important aspects of this is this very small space that overlooks the water, that frames the water in a particular way. And I have to say, for us, this museum, the ICA, was a kind of instrument for editing the context and also for deep focus inwards. Museums tend to be very inwardly focused, and so the question is, how do you actually make one that doesn't steal the show, and that one could have introspection and moments of kind of privacy and intimacy with the work, without dealing with the architecture. So sometimes architecture is an encumbrance. In this case, we were really kind of sampling the site from the inside. That was the big idea here. Another museum that we opened just recently is the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. And this was in a 1935, or using a 1935 printing plant. So it was a construction around existing factory space and also an existing small office building. And I'll just kind of whip through the slides here. So we dial up our voices loud and soft, depending on the context and what it is, what the research actually is. In the Broad, it was a very particular kind of problem where the Eli Broad is a private collection that was made public, and the brief said to actually that the most important thing was the archive itself, that is the storage of the work. And so we had this big problem to put basically an art storage facility on Grand Avenue, which is the main street of LA. And how do you do that and actually also engage the public? And so there would be an exhibition space. We changed the proportion of archive and storage to display, and with a concept that we call the veil in the vault. And these are just some images of the vault moving through it. So that's what holds the artwork. You basically are under it, it hovers over you, you spear through it, you land on top of it, on its surface. And one of the big experiments here was to make it 1 acre of space with indirect light coming through the veil, but column-free. So we're talking about 200 feet by 200 feet. So very, very big spans. Of course, this is subdivided into galleries, but it was very important to have this flexibility for us. And here is a gallery, actually. And in this particular museum, there is a circulation hub that's smack in the middle with escalators, elevators, and stairs, and a kind of winding stair that allows you to have a sneak peek into or a couple of them, into the archive. That is to see the pre-curated work. And in this particular case, we were very interested in the fact that this was not just, it wasn't a typical museum, it was a collection with a idiosyncratic collector. And we kept wanting to remind the public about that. And so this is what you see, some details. This is a lecture space, kind of like the one we're in. And I showed these museum projects just to say that we do make them, but we also take them down, and we are very interested kind of in a kind of critical approach to the museum. We're doing MoMA right now. We're doing a museum in Rio right now, and just about to start another. And so this, for us, we've been on multiple sides of the museum wall, so we're constantly thinking about what that wall means. And here was this retrospective that Franklin mentioned at the Whitney, and it was an opportunity. Retrospective means looking backwards, basically. And we kind of thought that the invitation to have a retrospective meant that this was the end of our work. And it was really a crisis that we went through. In the end, our work, we did not feel, at this point when this was put together, there were a lot of installations that were site-specific that were taken down and stored. That to put these installations back up in a museum, sort of as a body of work, didn't really make any sense to us. But what we did as a kind of umbrella idea was to make a series of galleries, each for one work, and the red dotted line represents the path of a robot drill that would be actually taking down the very walls that we put up as a live performance for 4 months. And so this is the robot, and we designed it with the engineers that did the Mars Driller. And it's basically a store-bought, hardware store drill. And these are the brains. So along this, something like 400-foot path or so in and out of the gallery walls, the drill would just pick an arbitrary spot and would stop and drill. And this would be a tremendous annoyance because you could hear it throughout the various galleries. And as the show progressed across several months, the walls just had more and more perforations until they started to actually break down. Here, this was, for all the architects in the room, this was a very, very difficult joint. Not so elegant, but it did the job. So this just went on and on its own. So this notion, and here is the curatorial text by curators other than us, and this drilled through and demolished the curatorial text also. The next project is actually in someone else's museum. This is Jean Nouvel, another contemporary architect in Paris. And we were invited, a year and a half ago, to celebrate and do a installation for the 30th anniversary of this building. And when this building was made at the Fondation Cartier, it's kind of a headquarters, but the gallery is on the ground floor, and it's all glass. And it's a huge provocation for artists and curators because what artists and curators don't like are glass walls. I mean, you really want to control light and views and atmosphere. So it has been a kind of provocation, and for us to come back and do some sort of installation there would have to be a kind of contemplation of glass itself and of architecture. And so this is one of the two galleries that are on the ground floor. This is the bigger one, and there's a core in the middle and a smaller one to the other side. The protagonist here was a bucket, and we wanted to do something that was a kind of riff on the kind of conventional way that we think of architecture when it doesn't work. It usually leaks. I mean, that is the cliche. So want to make this very provocative thing that the galleries actually emptied out of art There's really nothing there except this bucket, but the bucket is smart. Also, one other thing, the glass walls, which in the time that Nouvelle did this building, they were regarded as really state-of-the-art, very, very large sheets of glass. Today we see much more of that, but it was very unusual then. So taking for granted this transparency and view out. So this bucket somehow already knew where the leaks were going to be, and there's this kind of ballet, this choreography of the movement of the bucket, and it lands in a spot, and I don't have the best video of this, but that sound is the sound of a drop hitting the bucket of water. And we worked with David Lang, who's a composer, contemporary composer, to create choral sounds that picked up the pitch of the droplet of water as it landed. So there's liquid crystal on the glass, and it's phased to be transparent and to go translucent and transparent. And so when a drop lands in a bucket, it picks up a pitch of a recorded choral sound, and there's the resonance of that sound that's also magnified. And so it's smart, but it's not that smart. Sometimes it kind of So it catches, and then it moves on to do its next thing. So this is a little sped up view of it doing its thing. It's kind of undetectable where the next one will be. So this little bit of mischief somehow was there for a couple of months, doing its thing, and you know, I have to admit, you know, that there's some artificial intelligence in there, and it does work with the building's various systems. Now, to complement the robotic bucket here in this room. This is the bucket cam. So the side walls are the walls, actually, the side walls of the bucket, and it's looking up at the ceiling. And so if you look at the grid closely, you'll see it's just passing through. Anyway, and while it does its thing, I'll just say that I mentioned Franklin to Franklin just before that we're doing an opera now. It's called Mile Long Opera with David Lang. So it's the beginning of a collaboration. When I expect it to, it doesn't do anything dramatic. But once, okay, there, okay, demonstration. So in the other room, there's a suspended, very, very large monitor that's just about 1.5 meters off the floor. And you have to have like one of those mechanics, little dollies that mechanics use for to go under cars to actually see it. And beneath this is actually what the webcam is seeing. So it's a very psychedelic impression of these drops that become incredibly grotesque, and the sound is really, really magnified in this space. So it's actually a choral work with this visual accompaniment. So I would say it's more sound, but it's chant sound in space. So this is part of a series of sort of misbehaving elements in museums. So, while we make museums, we're also kind of trying to kind of look at them, look at their surfaces, look at their systems, all different types of systems. This project is actually different. We did this also commissioned by the Cartier Foundation. It was Paul Virilio was the kind of overall curator of this show, of which this was a very large component, and we were in a dialogue with him around issues of migration of populations around the globe. Home isn't what it used to be, and people leave homes for various reasons. Sometimes we do that for leisure as tourists, but a lot of people leave home because they have to, for political reasons, economic reasons, and environmental reasons. So this exhibition was really a look at that, and we worked with several other artists and geographers and statisticians. The kind of framework is it's a space in the round. Basically, it's about 35 feet across diameter with a very large projection and multiple projectors that produce a kind of inside-out world. And what you see is this globe, which is actually backwards. And as it spins, it kind of spins around the room and it prints as it spins. I'm just going to play a little bit of it. Okay, so this is kind of, you get the feel of the size. So when it first appears, it prints pixels, and those pixels start to move to describe the locations of the populations of the world. So as we all know, over 50% of the world's population live in cities and growing. So this was all made as a geocoded, data-driven project. So in other words, it's all factual, and it's derived from hundreds of sets of data sets, reliable data sets that we were able to find. And so we were able to tell these small stories. And for us, what was part of the experiment was to be able to, and these are just snippets here, to be able to make content and tell these very poignant stories around movement around the globe without using conventional narrative means, that is photography or video or film or narration. So these are geocoded pixels again. The world's population, these are cities that are losing, or parts of the world losing population and gaining population. So you could see the land masses just by this kind of the movement of the data. So here we're talking about remittances. So the remittances are these, it's like an informal economic network which plays a very critical role in the developing world. So it's like in many, I mean, this represents people sending small units of money home, like $100, $200, $300, and constitutes a great amount of foreign translation of economics. So in an informal way. So here, I mean, it's very, very kind of precise and high res. This shows you a little bit about that. So the fragmentation of these flags and the erosion is all, again, data related. So how much each pixel is given a value. We moved into political refugees and forced migration. So these are people who are forced off their land, or sometimes they move and they want to move, but their paths are simply blocked. So this scene plays global movement of refugees and IDPs, and it starts chronologically and keeps moving, and you start to see this flow of people, and it's 1 pixel is 10 refugees here. So if you imagine this now surrounding you, it becomes very poignant. And this was, our point was, can you tell these stories, or can you kind of sense anything of the power of this through abstract means? And that was our objective. And then moving on, this is the basically that line describes global north and global south. So that's basically the developed world and the developing world, except for Australia, which is below. But as the globe rolls out, it prints basically these flood events. So the size of the blue circle has to do with the size of the event, whether it's like a big hurricane, a big storm, or a smaller one, and the flood that ensues. And you could see the relationship between global north and global south. It largely has to do with poverty and infrastructure, and you see how many people actually had to migrate. So here you can see in Russia, on an event of the same size, 420 people are displaced, whereas in India, 3 million people are displaced with the same size event. So actually, just before I go there, one thing that was very, very important. So this is us behaving as artists, actually, in a museum and in a gallery, and not taking the walls down. But for us, each project is a kind of experiment. It's an extension of our research. And in this case, as I said, it's all about narrative and how you can tell stories and how you can tell very sort of serious stories with unconventional means. One thing that was very important here, we showed this at COP21, and COP before that was updated from COP15, and it has been going around the world. Actually, this week it opens in Shanghai and Melbourne, and next month it opens in Seoul, and it was in Paris a year ago. So it continues to move and continues to change. But one of the very important things that policymakers have told us in seeing this installation is that they know the information, they know the data is knowable, but they haven't seen the environmental data, political data, and geographical put together in one place in an effective way. And this actually makes new knowledge. So many people have understood things in very different ways, just simply by the way it's put together. So we're very interested in the telling of stories and information technologies and and data and stuff like that. So for us, pixels and bits and bricks are kind of all fair game in our work. And I wanted to show this. This is the first installation Rick Scofidio and I made when we started the firm together, started the studio before it ever had any interest actually in doing architecture. We're both architects. But we did this installation of something like 3,500 traffic cones, and they were spread all throughout Columbus Circle in New York, sort of visually connecting these disparate traffic islands in a way that that's distinctly New York, using an indigenous material to the site, traffic, so not romanticizing it. This kind of notion of working with found things or inherited everyday objects is still very much with us. Where we started our practice and where we are today is just kind of, we opened more avenues, but we're still kind of interested in the same thing. So I just came back from Milan, and we did an installation rethinking pants. So we wanted to use pants in a different way, in an architectural way. Well, what can we do with it? The invitation was to do an installation here outside at Palazzo Lita, which is this Baroque palazzo that has been transformed. Interior courtyard has been transformed at various points in time, and we were kind of looking at and scratching our heads around this as a unit of architecture, like as opposed to bricks. And we started to do these tests where we would put two units together and tie them together belt loop to belt loop and tug at the fabric to see how strong it could be in terms of making a tensile structure. And we found that actually it's able to take a considerable amount of stress. Wasn't designed for that. So we decided to use this, and we evolved this tensile roof that sheltered a good part of the courtyard for events that happened the last couple of weeks. So these are the units that are, some of them are prefabricated, and it looks really gruesome. I mean, I thought these photos were really interesting. So before they start to go together, and they're pneumatically filled with air. And here it is now looking up at the sky. So belt loop to belt loop, cuff to cuff, spreading across this space. And just go through these. So, I have no idea why we did this. This has absolutely no meaning. But I think we just had to get it out of our system. We just needed to make something out of pants. I don't know. Okay, on another matter, and as I said, this is very improv, and I thought I wanted to show you something that, architects a lot of the time do competitions, as some of you probably know. That's our main way of getting really interesting projects, and often they're invited competitions. And you put all of your energy into it, and you hope that you can beat out your close friends and colleagues. But these competitions, whether you win them or lose them, they actually kind of contribute to your to your body of work in some way, and they make you think harder for the next project. So this was a project that I'm just going to show you a little bit of. We were very interested in this moment, this Magritte moment, called the Magic Hour. And we did several projects based on this time frame when the sun is just setting and nighttime is just coming, is just starting to happen, and you have both day and night at the same time. And in the city, it's something that we take for granted. The sun sets, we're at work or we come from work or whatever, and the streetlights go on. But we never really think about that as a part of a social contract, kind of like turning on your tap water and expecting to drink, to have potable water, that won't get you sick. It's kind of the same thing, that we have these utilities that are somehow here and we really don't think about them. And this was an invited competition to light the bridges across the Thames. There are 17 of them in a line that they were very interested in sort of producing this project of illumination of the bridges. And for what we wanted to do was celebrate this moment, this magic hour where day becomes night. And what was extremely important was to actually pay attention to this moment, that we sleepwalk through every day, but in a very old-fashioned way, like when you're in an Italian hill town and you hear the bells chime at 6 o'clock, you can hear them everywhere. And we imagined that this is an effect of turning on the lights where everyone could understand that moment and could even, if you breeze through it, it's like a moment where you think a little bit about the synchronizing of the city for that moment, because we all have different shifts, we all have different lifestyles. So the notion was that each of these bridges would be illuminated, surface illuminated, from the banks to the center, progressively, in a kind of half an hour as the sun starts to set. And at the moment where the sun passes the horizon, there is a focal point where there's a strong light, a light beam that's pointed at the sky. And in total, all of those points, those 17 points, make a drawing in the sky of the Thames, of the shape of the Thames. And what I'm going to do, because this is a little bit longer than anybody would want to watch, I'm going to take it to a certain point, because there's some other things going on. Special moments, like when there are celebrations, this moment, this closing in of the, whoops, it's a little too, sorry. Okay, that moment, that celebration, the closing, one bridge would light the other like passing a torch. And so these were these robotic head searchlights that would just, when it hit the axis of the center point at a certain height, it would light the next one and the next one. So sadly, we didn't win, but God, that was a painful one. You know, when you really feel like you've got something that's, yeah, you think you nailed it and you don't get it. It's actually okay because you did it in your head. Okay, I'm going to go into another kind of project. Freewheeling Cure is an important building for us. That we just completed. And we do a fair amount of, as educators, we also build buildings for higher education. And this has been a sort of interesting ride. We've done now, I don't know how many, but quite a few. And three built ones, and I think we're doing three more. And this is for Columbia University Medical Education Center. And Columbia has these three campuses. The one on the left is Morningside, and it's a Beaux-Arts campus, all planned out, and it's really campus-like. It's got walls around the edges. The middle one is Manhattanville, and the master planner was Renzo Piano, and he basically fashioned it on the city as a grid and a series of buildings that would be basically in the city. Way uptown on 168th Street is the New York Presbyterian Hospital, and as an extension of that is the Medical Education Center, and it really is no campus to speak of. So it's kind of on the left here. These three towers are residential towers. They were built in the 70s, so we had this site, which was facing the Hudson, and but set in next to the road, but with a kind of kind of blocked or semi-blinded on left and right view of the George Washington Bridge, and it was actually a fantastic site because it was relatively freestanding and had three exposed sides. So that's right from the site where we can build on. And this is a site that we made a kind of outdoor space garden. So medical education, we know nothing about it. So we step into this. And as it appears, most medical education buildings are fat and low. And they're double-loaded corridors with lots of classrooms, and usually the teacher's in the front of the classroom and writes on the chalkboard, and it's kind of very standard kind of classroom setup. Our site was the one on the right, that's the zoning lot that we had on our site. And it was very tall and skinny with a very small footprint. So it's the most inefficient kind of site that you could have for this program, which we use to our advantage. So given this small footprint, when it narrows and tapers back, it's only 6,000 square feet. 1/3 of that is circulation, that is like the core, the elevators, and the egress stairs. So you're left with really 4,000 usable square feet. The organization of the building, the typical would put the public spaces at the bottom, classrooms, and then the offices on top. So faculty and admin would have the great views. What we did was on the right. We gave the students the great views. We put the offices at the bottom, and we put the kind of public space sort of up the building. And the diagram was this. It was like a vertical campus. We learned a lot about what medical education is today, and it's a little bit different. There's a lot of team-based learning and problem-based learning. That's really kind of very much kind of self-propelled, and students put themselves together in groups, smaller groups. And so what we did was on the south side of the building, which had a lot of exposure, and also to the east and west, we did this, what we call the study cascade, which is basically this open space, and it's an interpretable space. So some people think of flexibility as a big warehouse that's open and you could just break it down in any way you want. For us, flexibility here was lots of different types of spaces that you can find your preferred spot to sit in. Here is this thing without the skin. So you can see the south side. There are every floor to the south, which is to the left side of the image, is this cascade. And then there are some meeting rooms, the core, and then there's a big flexible classroom to the north. And then they stack like this, and then the stack into neighborhoods. So the spaces along the way are common meeting spaces, group study spaces, spaces where there's food and drink, very quiet spaces, acoustically controlled, larger areas with computers, also outdoor rooms and terraces. And that's basically the design of the competition that we won. In this case, that we won. And this is the building, and yay, sometimes it works out. And sometimes, and very rarely, it works out that the building looks like the competition entry. So we really lucked out here. And just to, this is really definitely Columbia University doing something very, very different here. And you could see the outdoor rooms and the vertical stack. And we all thought that, because these are double and triple height spaces and indoor, outdoors, totally variegated. And some people have asked, well, aren't you losing a lot of usable space? And I think of this as, as kind of, it's like necessary. It's a really necessary space. It's about oxygen. It's about views, and it's about choice. So these are some views here. It's a kind of constructed inefficiency, maybe. And so all of these spaces are different. This is a little study room that we call the Dustbuster. It's at the very top of the building. And outdoor spaces. And all of these spaces are used for education. So there was one of the more interesting stories here was that there was a debate in the faculty as to whether to train students on cadavers and traditional anatomy or on simulation robots. And of course, you can imagine whether the robots, they're, you don't touch real flesh, and there's no empathy for a robot. But on the corpses, there's nothing to lose because they're already dead. So when you're learning and practicing surgery on a corpse, it doesn't really That was the problem, one or the other, and it turned out that it's both and. So this is the anatomy lab. So this is when we had to clear out at the end of August, and for the first group of people to enter the building, it was a group of corpses. And so this was the first population, and of course, they were brought in, and there they are. There are like 35 of them, I think. So we had to finish our punch list in the space, and then it was off limits. But of course, it had its own ventilation system and everything. Quite interesting. But then there was, the high-tech stuff, simulation and kind of learning surgical skills here with these incredible instruments, simulation spaces where the operations on robots, and these were really real state-of-the-art technologies here. So you can do open heart surgery, and you could really monitor everything of human reaction and really understand and start to track back when there's a mistake. So we were accommodating this too. This was truly interesting. And there's also childbirth. And so students are taught how to deliver babies. And there are these kinds of robots, that deliver babies. And this was, I have to say, I witnessed this. And it actually, it didn't go so well. They had to put it back in, and they had to do it over and over again until I got it right. You don't get a chance to do that very often in real life, but that was pretty interesting. So our work really takes us in such different directions. Each project is kind of, it's an opportunity we didn't anticipate. In this case, we learned a whole new set of skills here and a new discipline. I wanted to come back around to museums, and I wanted to do it through just some preliminary slides here on the High Line, which is a project that we're still working on. We started, I think, back in 2004, designing it and doing this with field operations. But as anything that's linear. It could be cut up like a salami and done in stages according to funding. So, we did it. We kept sort of expanding and expanding. And this is it as of, I don't know, a year ago or so, shot from a helicopter. And the High Line was successful beyond our wildest dreams. And so this is kind of where already lots of buildings started to be built around it, and the property values started to escalate. But as all of that stuff grew, the High Line grew out, and all of the plant life and the richness inside also grew. The demography started to change. But I wanted to just mention that this became incredibly popular. Like, it started to become part of popular imagination, and this is Marvel Comics, and wherever we turned there was something High Line, The Simpsons, and they were marketing. Somebody was marketing this High Line perfume, which they advertised with the scent of wildflowers, green grasses, and urban renewal. That's like literally from their byline. And then they were marketing this High Line weed and all sorts of other things. In the end, the High Line was some kind of phenomenon that we still don't understand, and we're still trying to figure it out. One of the things that was very important was that I think the popularity had to do with the fact that we're productive people, and we're always doing something productive, especially in cities. When we're not in the gym and we're not on our computers, we're usually on our devices or walking our dog, burning calories or something. So this is a place for doing nothing, and that's a discovery here. And so this place inside of the High Line, this what we call the Sunken Overlook, that looks over 10th Avenue, looks at this very kind of monotonous view of the taillights of cars going up the avenue. And I think for us this kind of epitomizes this necessity in the city to kind of strip away distraction, and just maybe stare. So the noise around the High Line just kept growing, the hype, so much commercial activity around it. Everyone wanted to be called the High Line. The name was not copyrightable, so everything could be called the High Line. And so everyone capitalized. And so many buildings around this site were built as a result of these escalating property values and the kind of turnover and flipping of properties. When we first started the High Line, we were thinking about, we had to strip and remediate the soil there, this ballast basically. You know, and we had to bring back biodiversity and the green stuff and fauna and flora. But we also planted a certain kind of biodiversity of people, different strands of people and different uses. And many of them we didn't anticipate. The High Line went viral, and every city in the world is doing something like it, using their spent urban infrastructure or creating new linear parks. And they keep amassing. And we must have touched, we weren't the first, Promenade Plantée was the first actually in Paris, but nobody actually knows that. That was our reference. But then we become the reference for all of these others. And, you know, I think in the end, one of the important things, there's a lot of complaining in New York that it's too many people around there. New Yorkers don't like it anymore. But I think we touched on a sustainable strategy that many policymakers are finding very useful in all different parts of the world. So I wanted to end with a project that could have only really happened because of the High Line and the transformation of this whole area of what we call the far west side of Manhattan. You know, many architects live in their cities and they kind of imagine perhaps being invited to build in your own city. Usually you work someplace outside and then you get discovered back, or you get a reputation and then you're invited back and you're 80, you know, and you finally do your work in the city. We've been so lucky that we've had these multiple projects in New York, from the High Line to Lincoln Center to MoMA to Columbia University. And this one that I want to show you is a very, very unusual project. In this area in yellow here, which is Hudson Yards redevelopment, and this is the last undeveloped tract of property in Manhattan. And it's that way because it has an active rail yard. Nobody could figure out how to build on it. Eventually, related companies, a big developer, figured out how to do it and is building this huge multi-use complex. And the city carved out a small part of that property for cultural use, that is, for the city's protected and cultural use. And they sent out an RFP. Does anybody out there have an idea for a new institution, or does anybody want to expand? And that was sent out to kind of the general, to the you know, art institutions, architects, anyone that could possibly have an idea. David Rockwell is kind of strange bedfellow for us. He's another architect, works in a very different idiom, and we were together and we sort of cooked up an idea and we sent it to the city. And this was 2008. I think we were the only kind of crazy people to propose anything when the economy was collapsing. And so we proposed something that we called at that point Culture Shed. And its principles were these, that this new institution would address a need that was in New York, and actually many cities are very similar out there, because our arts are siloed. We have our performing arts in one place, our visual arts in another place. But there's really no place that's purpose-built to bring the arts together. And in fact, what would be culture, what would be the arts in the future, that's one thing. Nobody has any idea. And that's kind of the beautiful thing. In 15 years, we have no idea what it's going to look like. People more and more are working across disciplines. We wanted to make a building that was transformable, that could change, that was scalable, that also could be inside and outside somehow, and that would be unbranded. That wouldn't be like MoMA or the Whitney or any place with a lot of baggage, wouldn't have a collection, and somehow would be financially self-sustainable. At least this was an architect's dream. How could we make a building that could have some bit of earned income that would cover its operating expenses? So we put forward this idea. We made all of these books and research, and we somehow got the attention of the mayor of New York, and he came to our studio, and we presented Culture Shed. And we kind of made a lot of stuff up, We, how would it work, and who, there was no client, so we were making it all up, but we were using our best guesses at things, and so we put some financials together of how it could be sustainable, and the mayor said, this was Bloomberg at the time, and he said, do you have a business plan? And we said, what's a business plan? And so then, he said, come back in 4 months after you've thought this through. And so we went and we got experts involved, and we really thought through this and put together a business plan and brought it back to the mayor, and this project started to slowly build. We got a little bit of support from the city, and I would say not very much. We had a National Endowment for the Arts grant, and we did a lot of it for free, and we just worked on it. Eventually, and I show this slide because it shows a bit of the High Line. This is where the High Line tracks west and goes around the rail yards. This is the built-up Hudson Yards that's anticipated in 15 years or so. The yellow building is a building that we agreed to do. High-rise is our first and only, probably our last. And we did it out of self-defense to the Culture Shed, because we were smack against it, and we needed more space, and we needed to collaborate with whoever that architect was. And if it was us, we could probably do better. So the only model that we actually could imagine was the Fun Palace of Cedric Price. There was nothing really in the history of architecture really that's a great reference for us. But the Fun Palace in the 60s was imagined as this architecture of infrastructure, and basically it was to be kind of made and remade according to need. It involved a lot of cybernetic experts and thinking about what's next, and but really this very, very flexible kind of structure. This project almost happened. It ultimately never was realized. But that was this notion of architecture as infrastructure. That is, what do you really need in to create cultural stuff? Well, you need space, you need a piece of real estate, somewhere to work, somewhere to present. You need some thermal comfort. You need some strong bones to hold things. You need electrical power. I mean, those are the major things you need. Everything else, equipment comes and goes. Walls could go up and down. What we did was we had an open space to our east, and our proposal had been to make a fixed building with a stack of galleries, column-free galleries that were museum quality, and to make a shed which would telescope over the fixed building and would expand and contract. So it would expand when there was an extra large show, when there was an event, something that was large and needed it. But when you didn't need it, it could just fold back, and the space was open to the sky. You could have an outdoor concert, outdoor exhibitions. but it's basically could kind of create this indoor-outdoor space. And what was sustainable about that is that if you don't need that space, you don't have to heat it or cool it. You don't have to program it. But it's great to have it if you need it. So we imagine that 50% of the time it would be utilized. This is, the building is based on gantry crane technology from the shipping yards. And these are the little cross sections. So we imagine that the green cultural programming would happen either with the shed nested on 3 levels or deployed. You would get indoor, or you would get free programming, public programming in the shed, or you can get the one on the left, the blue one would be something like Fashion Week that would come in for 1 or 2 weeks in the year, let's say 2 weeks a year, and would produce a lot of income, and it's all plug and play. So a rental with a lot of income that would come from that. So this was actually, back in the days, this has advanced quite a bit, and it's changed, and what you're seeing here is at the level of the High Line, which is 25 feet up, there is a plaza. That plaza is the deck over the Hudson Yards, where all the buildings start. Below that is an active train yard. And we enter our building from the street, and we have 2 floors below, and we have those 4 floors above. But we also have 7 levels of the building next door. That's the high-rise that we're as well doing. So this shed building, which is now so it advanced. It really got traction. It got a great chairman of the board and started to grow. And it has an artistic director, Alex Poots, who is someone that actually is a kind of great impresario that puts really fantastic exhibitions and events together with various artists from different fields. And he's going to do this, much more of this here, because this is really going to be his instrument. And when he came in, he said, "This isn't flexible enough. I need more flexibility." And we gave him even more. So I'm going to show you this animation. Maybe we can get the sound up if there's someone up there. So these are the rail yards. They're active, decked over, and there's a kind of train theme here from the High Line to the active train yards to this building that actually rolls on tracks. So the shed is made of steel. It's very, very simple, just welded steel plates. Okay, so here you have, at ground level, at street level, the trucks and all of our deliveries are there to a very large freight, two berths and a large freight elevator. But the street just north of us is sloped, and you could drive a truck right up onto the plaza, and you could unload there. And so you could really use this big shed structure, this infrastructure, to haul things. And I should mention that the space above in the shed that you see, this kind of gray tone, to span the depth of the site, you need something. You could see people up there now. You need something like a 12-foot truss. And so we made those trusses open, and we made that into a theatrical deck. So the entire ceiling of the shed is actually one huge deck that you could fly anything in and out of. So this is like the fly space behind the proscenium at the Met, but you are the proscenium. The whole space is the proscenium. So you could stack many sets above. You can do anything you want with height. You can make the room feel smaller. You can have film. You can black it out. It could be acoustically isolated as well through the shades. And so we think of this as this very versatile and responsive instrument. So this is our version of Fashion Week that could take over the building. And as we started to, when we started to cook this up, we talked with curators, museum directors, artists, performing artists, visual artists, and there was an enormous amount of interest in doing something like this, because we are, even though artists like to work in smaller and smaller spaces, they haven't had enough big spaces, and this also has to do with economics. There are large guillotine doors at the lower 30 feet, and they can be entirely opened up as the glass wall of the fixed building can be opened up, so you have a continuous footprint of about 30,000 square feet, and you can have indoor and outdoor space. So here we are going into the theatrical deck. And so if you imagine, this is really nothing but strong points. You could hang 40 trucks from here. So one thing I wanted to mention is that Alex Poots, who is the artistic director, the very first thing he did was he extracted the word culture out of Culture Shed. And so it's now called The Shed. And he felt it was all self-evident. We actually had to use the word culture to get the interest in the project. We're called The Shed from the beginning. It wouldn't have gotten anywhere. This project, I wanted to show you some of the, just bring you up to date on this. So 2 different structural systems, one kind of a very ordinary steel grid, the other one is much more kind of delicate, and it's, this building rides on 6 points. It touches the ground on 6 points. These are some early renderings. That's the cross-section through the truss, and this is actually the structure of the building. You have a mechanical duct and the steel structure, and then it's clad in ETFE pillows, which is a Teflon-based a kind of air-inflated system. So the cladding has the thermal properties of glass at 1/100th the weight. The channel in between the structure and the ducts has the blackout shades. So this building is just bones. It's like bones and muscle. There's no fat on this building. So in construction, some of the steel nodes that are being made, and these are all modeled in digital project in our studio, and then go into fabrication. This bit of an elevation was dry fit, so the steel was fabricated by a fabricator that does dams and bridges and big infrastructural steel projects in Italy. And so they laid out, they dry fit these steel members just outside the factory, just to see how close they are to tolerance. And you could see the scale. You could see that guy in the middle. It is really big. There we go. And it all fit really well together. And this is really done by, it's a family business, beautifully welded. So as I said, plate steel, it's not, there's no cladding. The kinetics are a rack and pinion system, and it's just the motors are on top and wheels at the bottom just roll. So to deploy the shed, it takes 5 minutes, and it takes the horsepower of 1 Prius. So it is extremely economic and sustainable. So these are the wheel assemblies, and this is the forging of the wheels. You could see the steel is made very strong, and then it's turned on a lathe and becomes the makings of the wheels, and then the roller bearings are put in, and the axles and the chassis, and then it's put together. So that's our engineer, and he's tall, so it's the height of him. Okay, so these are just more. So this is the actual sled drive, and those are the motors. They're really small, and the rack and pinion system, and it just is kind of very dumb. I mean, we pride ourselves in the dumbness of this. So there it is, going back and forth. It's very, in a way, it's technology, old-fashioned technology is just updated. And so in the factory, we were just running these two to sync them up side by side. In real life, they're actually separated out. And it's run basically off of your belt. You could just strap this thing on and just make it move. And I don't want to make such a big issue out of the movement, because the movement will in fact be a kind of celebration, like barn raising every time, and it could be integral to any of the work that's created for the shed. But it's really there as a kind of opportunity to have indoor and outdoor space, and to be able to build your space in increments. You could have a little bit open or quite a lot open. And so here we are. And so the construction sequence was very interesting. First, the contractors built the frame building in place, the fixed building, and then they used it to brace the shed. And so the shed started to be built from the wheels up. So the wheels were, the tracks were put in, the wheels were put on the tracks, and the steel was erected and bridged across. And eventually, when this is completed, which will be next month, just the major structure, the shed will be moved over so that the fixed building could be clad in its exterior material, and both buildings could start to be built. So it's like basically a kind of simple way of using one building to build the other, and then once the other is a kind of gantry, it could help the first. So it's this kind of interesting organism. So when you're looking down you're looking northward here, the shed, the fixed building, and the tower in those, and this is the in construction, the fixed building, 2 19-foot galleries, one 23-foot high, a convertible space. It could be galleries, could be theatrical. Wheels coming on site. And you could see like some of these big buildings around it. It's really scary. Brave New World. So we are one of the beneficiaries of the High Line, in a sense, to be able to have this opportunity to build this. So the wheels arriving, then the first steel goes up. Those prongs that you'll see will eventually hold the frames that hold the pillows, the ETFE pillows, and those will be just have a kind of liner on them so you won't see them. But everything else is exposed in this building, and going up really like an erector set. Sometimes I pass by the site because our studio is 4 blocks away, and there are some magnificent moments. Like we have 4 single wheels, and we have 2 double wheel assemblies called double bogies. And so this is the craning in of this extremely heavy double bogie, which needed to be because of the way it's weighted. So the way it works is that basically the entire weight of the building, which is about, 8 million pounds, is distributed on 8 wheels and 1 and 2 sets. So each wheel carries 1 million pounds effectively in a surface the size of your hand, of your palm. So it's pretty interesting. And here it is. This is just a couple of days ago. Just kind of it's just partially deployed. It's like a third deployed there. It's the way it started to be erected. And in closing, I would say, our studio over the years resisted architecture, or we thought everything was architecture. We still believe that doing work in public spaces, doing work in media, through the lens and filter of an architect, a kind of critical faculty of an architect in space, produces or expands the discipline of architecture. But we resisted doing buildings for a very long time, and then we started to do buildings, and we started to hack at the buildings, and we continue to do that and to think about them critically. At the same time, we're executing buildings, and this is, I would say, a model for a future practice, which we would love to do, and that is that expanding the agency of architecture even further to encompass putting new ideas on the table, because usually we are the recipient of already of conventional ideas, conventional programs, and we twist them and we tweak them and we make them a little bit different and a little better. But it's very rare that one has the opportunity or one has even the sense that it's even possible to put an idea on the table and actually see it realized, be your own client for a while until there is an actual client. And so this, for us, this project is groundbreaking in that it contributes to looking at architecture in a much more broad way, the architect as a client and as an active ingredient in policy making and in thinking up new programs, raising money and enacting, making things happen. That's all I have. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
This is a supreme honor to have you here in Miami. This is very beautiful. I'm interested in, you showed the Paris Museum, or the museum in France. It was just like the open volume space, and then you had the fog, that in and out fog. Is that the glass that is actually like some sort of apparatus that transitions into like a foggy glass? Because the Cartier.
No, so this
Cartier,
is this is Jean Nouvel's Fondation Cartier, and it's all glass. And what we did was we put a film on it. It's like a 3M film that's electrified, and basically it produces a foggy effect on the film, and on the glass. So it's a film you could turn it on and off with electricity, basically.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, I was aware of this technology several years ago, where I saw like something on the History Channel. It was some bathroom in some restaurant, and it cost like $50,000 for like 2 pieces of glass. And so when I saw this, I was like, there's this like monstrous amount of money that's being.
No, it's actually liquid. It's liquid crystal, and it comes in a sheet form,
right,
like plastic, and basically there are just some copper wires that run through it. And if you did a permanent installation, you would put it in between glass. And we have done that before. It's not quite that expensive. But here, we just put the film really on the surface of the glass, and then it was taken off. So it's a technology that exists, is being perfected. They keep talking about opacifying glass, that there would be someday, and we keep waiting for that product to happen. But in this case, when you mentioned fog, we actually made a building out of fog, but that was a while ago. Yeah.
One more thing.
Yeah.
You are on a league of your own, and what material haven't you worked with, and what material do you wish to work with? Because you seem to have worked with just about, now with the denim, it's just like...
Well, it's a good question. I think that, it's all of the stuff, like the stuff that architects typically work with, also can be used in different ways. Concrete and steel and wood and the typical materials, are there to be rethought as well. We're also working with recycled materials and looking at that. But also, new materials are kind of like where architecture can be pioneering, right? And working with chemists and engineers to imagine and to invent new materials that have very, great tensile strength and great compressive strength and that behave differently. So, I guess there's no particular material that's next, but, as you mentioned, like fog was for us a material to think about, how it's kind of vapor, right? And space doesn't have to be defined by walls, right? It could be defined as a kind of drifting mass. So, anyway, maybe cotton, maybe silk. Yeah.
I was wondering what is your opinion in the new industrial revolution that we're having. This making people that can print 3D components at home and work with robotics and Arduino. And you've been interested in your work since the 90s in robotics and kinetics. And I'm wondering what you think the role is now that we have the power of making 3D printing. How do you think this new industrial revolution will translate into architecture?
The acoustics are not so great this way, so I heard parts of what you're saying. We use, we would love to print a building. That would be really very interesting. A lot of my students, I teach at Princeton, are really pushing the envelope on robotics and new fabrication processes. And what's interesting that I find really the experiment out there and that a lot of young people are interested in is going one step beyond the controllable machine. And that is that we know, we work in BIM, all sorts of systems, and we can make smart buildings, and we could fabricate, and we could, write from, design through fabrication processes very quickly. But, what happens when the robot itself has agency? And what happens when, and I see some students shaking their heads because I think that's really in the air, that young folks are interested in the chance and in things that are not entirely predetermined, and materials, the way materials behave. If you use a robot, for instance, as a collaborator, and you have a thought, and in real time you produce something with defects, and there's a defect in a material, you scan the material, you start to have another processes, an automated process that performs, and then you think critically and aesthetically on that. And so, is it possible to have a new relationship with thinking machines? I think that is potentially a place.
Good afternoon. Thank you for a magnificent lecture. I look forward to seeing you again in Orlando. Even if it's the same lecture, I'll be happy to see it again. My question is in regards to your heritage. I know you were born in Poland, and your comment about the sort of the privilege of working in what you were saying in the city that you were from, in this case, New York. I don't know if Diller, Scofield, and Renfro has worked in Poland, or if you, at some point in your career, were looking forward to go back and do work there.
Okay, that's interesting. We're really open. Do you have a project? My family left Poland when I was very young, and I feel I like to be the outsider. So when an American asks me what I am, I say I'm Polish. I'm European. I'm Polish. And when a Pole or a European asks me what am I, I'm an American. So I always want to be the outsider. But we haven't really firmly built work. We're working in China. We're working in Latin America. We're doing something in London right now, but we haven't done a fixed building yet, like a permanent building anywhere in Europe. We're doing a park in Moscow. That's the closest to basically the geography. But, and that's a very complicated thing. Actually, Russia today is, as we all know, very, very complicated. And I didn't show it today because I don't know why I didn't show it. I'm not quite ready. But we're doing a park next to the Kremlin. And it's the 35 acres of brand new park surrounded by historic buildings. And in a way that is, we came to this in a kind of critical way. We were selected from an international jury to do this park. So it's a pathless park and called Wild Urbanism. And that has been very, very interesting to work in the context. It's a city project and just very interesting to figure out, what our set of values are and what's transmittable, what's global, what's local. And this is a learning curve for us. And so, one thing that was very interesting was just even the climate, that making a park in a place where it's really cold is a brand new thing. And our invention there is augmented climate. So we're extending the summers, the warm weather into the winter a little bit in various areas through passive means. So, in wherever we have an opportunity to do a project, we like to really dig deep. And there are certain things as global, people today, it's very hard not to feel that everybody shares your values, but sometimes there are things that, that you can take to another place, and so you have to read between the lines wherever you are. So, I'd be very interested to go back to Poland to do something, and there may be some opportunities in the area, but who knows? Yes.
Theodore Francesca developed the theory of the vanishing point to solve a practical aspect for an architect in Florence, namely to project on a two-dimensional plane what is three-dimensional, and they had to work with wood to make the building. He could make it in paper, but faster and cheaper. What do you think nowadays is corresponding to that? Do we have something that will have the influence that the vanishing point had on art, like a painting, that is applied today to practical problems of architecture?
Oh, that's really an interesting question. I guess I always drew in perspective. My sketchbook is perspective, although in my education, I was a student at Cooper Union. It was cabinet projection. So everything was flat, right? Elevation and plan were flattened into one plane. And John Haydock, who was my guru basically there, felt the world was flat. And he convinced everybody that the world was flat and everything was two-dimensional. I guess, the forms of representation in the way that you draw, the methodology of creating a project has everything to do with what the outcome is. And sometimes we're limited by our tools. And in architecture, there are many pieces of lived experience, designed experience that I would love to be able to use, but those tools don't exist. Like there's no way of registering time, really. You can do time lapse, but there's no way of building time really into a set of drawings. And it's not easy, let's say. The actual experience, you can do digital modeling of everything. You could fly around space, you can zoom in and zoom out, but to actually be able to describe a space, the quality of space, very, very difficult. We've been experimenting with VR, and we just did a project at the Jewish Museum for the work of Pierre Chareau, where we showed pieces of furniture that were without places, but we positioned them in the original settings that they were really designed for. in the exhibition. It was very effective. It was, because I never really believed that VR was particularly interesting, and now we found a reason why we needed it, and we're using it. So I think that there are some tools out there that potentially can be translated. They come from entertainment industry or gaming, but there are some things that we just really don't. I think we need to develop notational systems, like choreographers have struggled with how to build time and movement into and musical notation, like how abstract, how real. Those are the questions I ask myself all the time. So I don't have a good answer, but I can say I have the same problem.
I know you just mentioned that you had gone to Cooper Union. I'm an architecture student myself, and I wanted to ask, how do you feel, what pushes you continuously concerning your education and your lifelong career? What has gotten you to continue to push the envelope of design, and what is your motivation, your philosophy in life as an architecture to continue on and move forward?
I think making trouble, I think it's, I don't, I think that I never wanted to be an architect, for instance. I was an artist. I was trained as an artist first, and I always thought that, that was work for other people. And I fell into architecture by accident, and it was this, Cooper Union and John Haydock that made me think about that there are broader horizons. And he actually didn't practice. He wrote poetry and he made drawings. And I realized then that architecture is more than just building buildings. So I came into it through the side. I was doing everything other, and then I started to do architecture. I think that I never did it, our studio, Rick and I that started the studio, we never took on small things to build bigger things with an intention of doing bigger and bigger things and getting more well-known or having more power or doing bigger projects. It was always curiosity, and it was always a sense of criticality. And I think we're very interested in the everyday. We're interested in looking closely at conventions, everyday conventions. And that's why, even the traffic cones and the pants, they're just everyday things, maybe twisted and turned on their head. And, it's not about form making. It's really about rethinking conventions of space. And I think and so for us, it doesn't matter whether it's a drinking glass or a city, whether it's a theater work or an exhibition or a curatorial project or a book or a project for the internet or something like that. They're all different platforms, but they're kind of extensions of our curiosity. And I think what propels me is working collaboratively, also with other architects and engineers and smart people and composers and writers and choreographers, sharing ideas and also kind of being puzzled together and looking at the world and trying to figure out, this is very important ultimately, and it's very sincere that I believe that we can make things a little bit better. And that's why we broke out into doing things in the cities and more permanent things in cities, because it takes a lot of energy to do that. It's very hard to do it, make buildings like, deal with budgets, deal with, with all the forces around. Like Lincoln Center was a huge maturing project for our studio, working so hard with something like 12 constituent organizations that each had veto power, and all of these city agencies and historic preservation groups and community boards and everything. But when you do something and you actually contribute to a city, it's an exhilarating feeling that you can do something positive and people can, and you don't have to stamp it with your name, and you just feel like you're part of the forward movement. And I would just qualify, one thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about is the High Line these days, because when we imagined the High Line initially, it was what Giuliani wanted to, as the former mayor, wanted to demolish it. And a small group of citizen activists pushed to save it. And when Bloomberg came into into power, when he became mayor, he reversed a court order to demolish it. And at that point, the city still wasn't convinced it could be a park. And we spent a very long time trying to convince everybody that this could work and people would be interested and would come. And so it was originally thought of as like 300,000 people could come. That's what we advertised. Last year was 7 million people. And, and with that, came all this growth, right? And a lot of tourism, and the demography of the whole area started to change, and it was really interesting, but it was really blown out, and now it's getting very densified, but it's also a lot of the poor people in the area got displaced. And it makes one really think about, how you step into the life cycle of a city, and you step into this decay cycle, and you start to transform it, and it could happen very fast, maybe too fast. So a lot of what drives me is just really thinking about, how you do that, like how to do it the right way the next time. How would you do that the right way? I don't think you could ever get it right if you wanted to, but that's one of the things I think about.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Elizabeth.
Okay.